In most cities on earth, affordable housing means one thing: small, poorly built, far from everything, a place people live because they have no other choice. But here is what nobody tells you. In Singapore, 77% of the entire population lives in government-built apartments. Not because they are forced to, not because they cannot afford anything else, because the government built something so good that most Singaporeans choose it over private housing even when they can afford not to. Government-built apartments with swimming pools, with rooftop gardens, with hawker centers, serving $2 meals on the ground floor. Apartments that people sell on the open market for over $1 million in one of the most expensive cities on earth, built by the government for everyone, and every city that still has a housing crisis knows this exists, understands exactly how it works, and has chosen not to do it. This is that story. To understand what Singapore built, you first need to understand what it was starting from. In 1960, Singapore was newly self-governing, desperately overcrowded, and facing a housing crisis so severe that most of its population lived in informal kampong settlements, wooden villages with no running water and no sanitation. These were not temporary camps. They were where the majority of the population permanently lived. Fires tore through them regularly. In May 1961, a fire in the Bukit Ho Swee kampong tore through the settlement in hours and left 16,000 people homeless overnight. 16,000 people overnight. The government looked at what had just happened and at the tens of thousands more living in identical conditions across the island, and made a decision. It established the Housing and Development Board within days, with a single mandate: house the nation fast, no consultation period, no feasibility study, no waiting. In its first 5 years, the Housing and Development Board built 54,000 flats. By 1970, 36% of the entire population had already been rehoused. By 1989, more than 80% of Singapore's resident population was living in Housing and Development Board flats. A country housed the overwhelming majority of its population in under 3 decades, starting from almost nothing, on an island the size of a small city. No other government in history had done anything close to this at this speed and at this scale. But speed alone does not explain why Singaporeans still choose to live in these flats today, 60 years later, when Singapore has become one of the wealthiest societies on earth. That requires a different explanation entirely, and it starts with the single most important decision Singapore made, one that almost every other government looked at and quietly walked away from. In Singapore, you do not rent your flat from the government, you own it. The government sells flats to citizens at heavily subsidized prices and allows residents to use their mandatory pension savings, called the Central Provident Fund, to pay for them. The Central Provident Fund is a savings scheme where both employees and employers contribute a percentage of monthly salary automatically. For younger workers, the combined contribution rate is up to 37% of wages, split between employee and employer, saved every single month without the resident ever having to think about it. These savings accumulate across a working life and can be used directly to purchase a flat. First-timer households earning no more than 9,000 Singapore dollars per month can receive up to 120,000 Singapore dollars in additional government grants on top of their savings. A family earning the median Singapore income, buying a standard 4-room flat in a non-central area, can end up paying less than 200,000 Singapore dollars total, with no cash deposit required and no traditional bank mortgage needed. The money was already being saved. The government then made it affordable on top of that. This single decision changed everything. When people own their home rather than rent it, they maintain it, they invest in it, they feel connected to it, they care about the neighborhood around it. The home ownership rate among Housing and Development Board residents today is 90.8%. 9 in every 10 residents of government-built apartments in Singapore own the home they live in, In London and New York and Sydney, public housing is associated with renting, with poverty, with neglect, with estates that decline over decades because nobody who lives there has any stake in maintaining them. In Singapore, public housing is associated with ownership, stability, and community. The difference is not the buildings. The difference is one policy decision about whether residents rent or own. Now, here is the part that stops most people completely when they hear it for the first time. After a minimum occupation period of 5 years, residents can sell their Housing and Development Board flat on the open resale market at full market value. In 2024, an unprecedented number of resale flats sold over 1 million Singapore dollars. Government-built apartments in a public housing program selling over $1 million on the open market. The flat that the government subsidized for you, that you bought with your pension savings at below market price, becomes a fully appreciating asset that grows in value over time and can be sold, upgraded from, or passed on to your children. Singapore did not just solve affordable housing. It built a system where affordable housing is also how ordinary people build wealth. A first-generation family that moved into a Housing and Development Board flat in the 1970s could have sold that same flat decades later for enough money to fund their retirement. Government housing as a wealth-building tool for the people who needed it most. If this is making you think about your own city differently, subscribe, because this is one of many stories about problems that were already solved somewhere else, and most people were never shown them. But none of this was possible without one more decision, and this is the decision that every other city looks at, understands completely, and refuses to make. In 1966, 6 years after establishing the Housing and Development Board, the Singapore government passed the Land Acquisition Act. It gave the government broad legal powers to acquire privately held land at below market rates for public purposes. This allowed the Housing and Development Board to access land at a fraction of what it would have cost on the open market. Today, the government owns approximately 80% of all land in Singapore. Private developers build on land leased from the state. When land values rise, the profits go back to the public purse rather than to private landowners. The government captures the value that its own infrastructure investments create and reinvests it into building more housing. This is the mechanism that makes everything else possible. And this is exactly where every other city stops. In London, in New York, in Sydney, land is primarily private owned. When those cities try to build affordable housing, they face the same wall every single time. They must either buy land at full market rates, which makes affordable housing financially impossible to deliver at scale, or they must convince private landowners to donate or discount their land, which almost never happens voluntarily in any meaningful quantity. Singapore did not negotiate with that wall. It removed it entirely 60 years ago with a single piece of legislation. Every other city is still standing in front of the same wall today, holding another public consultation, publishing another housing strategy document, announcing another task force, and calling the problem unsolvable. If that makes you angry, you are not alone. Like this video so more people see what has been possible all along. The results of Singapore's approach are not difficult to measure. Singapore has one of the highest home ownership rates in the world at 90.8%. It has virtually no street homelessness. Its public housing estates have maintained a resident satisfaction rate above 90% for most of the past 15 years. Singaporeans are not just housed. They are satisfied with where they live. They own what they live in, and the asset they own is worth more every decade. Now compare that to what is happening everywhere else. In London, over 300,000 households are currently on the council housing waiting list. The average wait time is over 10 years. In Sydney, the social housing wait list sits at over 50,000 applications, with waits stretching beyond a decade in some areas. In San Francisco, the average studio apartment rents for over $2,500 per month. The city has spent decades debating housing reform, funding studies, launching initiatives, and holding community meetings. It has not meaningfully solved the problem. In Toronto, average rents have more than doubled in 10 years. In Amsterdam, workers are leaving the city because they cannot find anywhere to live. These are some of the wealthiest cities in the world. They are not failing to solve the housing crisis because they lack the money or the knowledge or the examples to follow. Singapore has been there, visible, documented, studied for 60 years. Every urban planning department in every one of these cities knows exactly what Singapore did and exactly how it works. They have chosen not to do it. The reason is not complexity. The reason is not that Singapore's approach only works in Singapore. The reason is that the Land Acquisition Act required the government to take on the most politically powerful interest group in any developed economy: private landowners, property developers, the people whose wealth depends entirely on land values rising without limit and on governments competing to buy that land at market rates rather than acquiring it in the public interest. Singapore in 1966 was a young government with a genuine emergency on its hands and a leader, Lee Kuan Yew, who was willing to make enemies of the people, who would have profited most from the alternative. Most governments in most democratic countries are not willing to do that. So they do not. And they call the problem unsolvable. And 300,000 families in London wait 10 years for a home that Singapore would have built for them already. Singapore decided this in 1960 when it had almost nothing. No natural resources, no hinterland, no inherited wealth. Just a housing crisis, a mandate, and the willingness to make the decisions that solved it. 6 decades later, 77% of its population lives in government-built apartments, owns them, is satisfied with them, and uses them to build generational wealth. The rest of the world is still waiting for the right moment to act. There is no right moment. Singapore proved that 60 years ago. Every city that still has a housing crisis made a choice, and they are still making it today. If this video changed how you see the housing crisis in your city, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe, because the next video covers how the same government that solved housing also built one of the most efficient public transit systems on earth, and why no other country has come close to replicating it.